gentlemen, thank you. Firstly, thank you very much for coming. Can I just say, I take great pleasure in this delightful setting. It just seems to me that it would be hard-pressed to find a more gracious and appropriate setting than this particular room in this particular club. And in that sense, I hope that you have both enjoyed the food, which is still coming out, and I've often used this analogy. I see my role in speaking at this time as roughly equivalent to the role of the appendix in the human body. And the medical summary is, at best it does no harm, and at worst it should be removed as quickly as possible. So I'm very much acting on that principle. What I'd like to do is to very quickly just highlight for you a couple of things about this year. I'd like to show you some slides. In other words, it's very much a picture type quick coverage. And so, without dwelling on them, we should take great pride that through the efforts of our membership, our journal is now national. I particularly would like to pay tribute to Theo, Doug Rosa and others who contribute to the very high quality monthly newsletter. I'd like to particularly acknowledge the work of Ron Lyons and his team in terms of the monthly lunchtime lectures. They've been absolutely outstanding in my view in terms of the quality of that presentation this year. And an absolute highlight for me was the annual seminar. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, in other words, if you weren't there but you haven't had a look at the webcast, could I particularly draw your attention to the opening address by the Governor. It was insightful, it was very, very good. And it just seemed to me that the Governor gave us great honour by the fact that she just didn't come along and deliver set speech number 7, or whatever you might view that as being. I can confirm to you the strong support that we have from our vice patrons, and I would also particularly like to acknowledge again the work of Theo and others on the very large and rapidly growing international presence we have through our webcast and social media. And it's one of our interesting dilemmas that one of our biggest followership is China. And that's an interesting reflection of the achievement that we have in terms of becoming a global profile institute rather than simply, you could come to Castlereagh Street or wherever once a month type institute. And it would be very remiss of me not to pay tribute to the work of David and Paul as our past presidents in getting us to where we are in the Anzac Memorial. And it just seems to me that all of us must be enjoying the number of people who come and say, what a great setting, I didn't know this was here, because finally, rather than being locked away on level 20 of Defence Plaza, we're actually in a place where the public can find us, and we're really benefiting from that particular reality. Not all beer and skittles. We simply must continue to try to attract younger members. We have a real issue of succession planning. I may get 53 years of marriage by confirming to Wendy today that I'm not planning to stay on as president at the end of my term, so there is some prospect of the marriage continuing. I would really like to acknowledge that we have to work more strongly to get a corporate base and particularly a sponsorship base. And we are discussing at the moment moving back to remunerated key staff, in other words, an office manager, honorarium type arrangement, because again, the sheer publicity and access by the public to us now is really creating a serious extra pressure on being able to reliably be there, reliably service and reliably administer. And the corollary of that is we've got to stop overworking a few people. We've got a few key people like Paul and Mike and others who just put in enormous amounts of personal time. I firstly want to acknowledge that, but also to say I frankly don't think it's long-term healthy. We've really got to spread the work base in that sense. I'd like to finish by, in a broad sense, just saying thank you to that range of people. I'm happy to name people in words, but not put it in a presentation on writing. So to everyone who's helped, thank you so much. To those who are with us today as our partners, thank you for being willing to have us out and let us go out to play. We appreciate it very much, and thank you for the opportunity for your support. I'd just like to show you some pictures. For those of you who haven't been able to come, have a look at what our year has actually been looked like in terms of the experience that we've had through the high quality work that we've just been talking about. In the first half of the year, we tried to we're working on a broad theme of improving Australia's regional security, and in the first half of the year we kind of delved down into some practical stuff like the new upgrades of armour, the new upgrades of aviation and so on. And then in the second half of the year we tried to concentrate on the AUKUS agreement, which is far wider than simply nuclear submarine propulsion. To some degree it's been misrepresented as simply, are we going to apply nuclear propelled or nuclear powered submarines? It's far wider than that, and the implications are quite massive. So here's a quick visit through what we did. Our January was Chris Skinner giving us an outstanding presentation on the challenges of building and developing nuclear submarines. It's up on the website, and if you'd like to have a look at it, I would commend it to you very strongly. It's got some great illustrations, some great explanations of what the heck does this really mean. We then had in February Kim Osley, who is the New South Wales Defence Advocate. He's a retired Air Vice Marshal F-111 driver, and Kim basically came and spoke to us about what are the opportunities for New South Wales in the massive expansion of defence that is happening or is about to happen. In March, we had the 81 Wing Group Captain and Wing Commander, Matt McCormick and Chris Hake, come and speak to us about what are the implications of the F-35 and the Loyal Wingman program that's being introduced. And in very simple terms, the F-35 will be associated by a lot of drones, and in combat terms you don't know which is the F-35 and which isn't. So in very broad terms we had that presentation. It's up on the web. I'd commend it to you, and that just is the beginning of that particular presentation. In the next month we had Major General Jobson, who was the head of the newly upgraded Army Aviation Command, talking to us about Army aviation. We had Brigadier Langford in June talking to us about the significance of the acquisition of 155s and the new M1A3 Abram tanks. And by the way, that's still not fully resolved. Some of you might be aware that there's some real discussion about whether we should proceed with the heavy armour acquisition or not. And that was the beginning of that particular presentation. It too is up on the web. We then had one that I thought was very different and very interesting, and that is Brent Clark from the Australian Industry and Defence Network, broadly saying to us, how do we regain sovereign manufacturing capability? And it's a very different angle, but in very simple terms. Can I remind you that if you go as far back as serving in Vietnam, the Swedes would not permit us to use the Carl Gustaf anti-tank weapon in Vietnam. Why? Because although it was our infantry anti-tank weapon, the intellectual property was still owned by Sweden, and they did not agree that we should fight in Vietnam. So the infantry was deprived of the anti-tank weapon because of the failure to arrange intellectual property. That's the kind of stuff that this presentation was on about. That's Brent Clark. Again, it's up on the web. We then had Adam Lockyer from Macquarie University talking to us about sea power in Australia's strategic environment. And the thing that I found the most interesting was that basically he said to us, what are the Chinese learning from our exercises and what do we learn from their exercises? And which bits are the choke points? Which should we really be defending? And would you notice that in David-led submission from RUSI and in other submissions to the current Defence Review, one of the things that's going to be tested is should we put an F-35 base on Norfolk Island? So I've got to tell you, there's some fascinating community-wide challenges and discussions that are about to come and if you want some of that background, I'd commend you to have a look at the webcast of August. That's the beginning of that one. We then had Vijay Varadarajan, I probably didn't pronounce that correctly, sorry Vijay, coming down and talking to us about cybersecurity. And the reason I'd like to mention this is the very strong partnership we are developing with the University of Newcastle. Alex Zielinski, who used to be the head of Defence Science and Technology, is now the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Newcastle. I employed Alex as a junior lecturer into the University of Wollongong, and Alex's career and mine are roughly equivalent to the space shuttle versus a failed launch. So, in very simple terms, Alex has had a meteoric rise. He's currently the Vice-Chancellor, he's still a good friend, and we're currently negotiating a partnership between RUSI, the University of Newcastle, and the University of Wollongong. So if we are successful in that, we'll start to use our networks to problem solve in defence through research, projects and similar. There's Vijay. We then had Hayden Cole speak to us about the massive funded project that's just underway about developing guided weapons capability for Australia rather than importing them. And I've got to say to you, in a slide that you'll see in a minute, one of the major places where that will happen is Orchard Hills on the northern road up towards the new Badgerys Creek Airport. So this is not a remote concept done somewhere in South Australia or over there, and some of this stuff is really local and very interesting. One of the things that Hayden shared with us is, did you know that Ukraine has depleted 7 years of US reserves of missiles already? So with the US running down its stocks massively, what's happening in the US is that they're re-gearing up their manufacturing capabilities simply to replace what Ukraine has already used in that very sad, very tragic conflict. And what was a highlight was November, the AUKUS 1 Year On seminar. One of the things that I think we get great recognition for is our ability to bring senior commanders to the Anzac Memorial and have senior commanders meet with our members and our members meet with them. So I've already mentioned the excellent opening address by Her Excellency. We had a thoughtful, and I might add in Sir Humphrey's terms, courageous brief by the Fleet Commander, because when I first approached Jonathan, he said, "I can't speak about AUKUS." I said, "Oh, okay. Well, can you come and tell us what's happened in the fleet?" "Yes." But by the time he actually came to speak to us, he had permission to speak about AUKUS. He had gone into the system and deliberately got permission to cover some aspects of AUKUS. By the way, it's such a rapidly changing thing that don't bother to look at it because it's out of date. But the point I'm trying to make is that's serious active support rather than notional support. Matt Pearce gave us a pre-recorded speech because he was that week handing over to Major General Susan Coyle, who is the new Forces Commander. David Tomei came and briefed us on 2nd Division, and for any of you who have a history of serving in New South Wales, the Army Reserve was essentially the 2nd Division plus. Now, 2nd Div is now an Army Command with a very different role, and it's good that David was willing to come and brief us. He's a barrister from Brisbane in his civilian life. And one of the more interesting characters was a New Zealander called Nick Osborne. And I've got to tell you, they breed some interesting characters in New Zealand. So Darren Goldie, the Air Commander, apologised. He was in Hawaii and he was going to do a link up, and he said, "I think it's probably better I send Nick, he's a far better personality." It turned out that he was, and could I also say he joined RUSI that day. So there was a nice bonus in both directions. And yesterday we had Paul Kelly. Paul gave us a year in review, the Sir Herman Black lecture, and can I remind you that Sir Herman Black, as Chancellor, used to come and give that to us just as part of supporting RUSI. I think it would be fair to say that Paul, who normally commentates on Sky News and writes for The Australian, could be regarded as having a particular view of life. That would be a very gentle way of saying he sees the world in particular ways. But yesterday, I thought that Paul gave us a superbly balanced analysis of the last year. I would urge you to have a look at it. I'd like to pay tribute to John Hough, who at 7:15 this morning emailed me to say it's up on the web. Thank you, John. And my advice would be medical help might assist you in terms of not having to work at that time of the night. But having made that point, it is already up. And it is one of the more balanced commentaries I think that you will see. And if nothing else, could I challenge you to have a look at the summary of Paul Kelly on the achievements of Scott Morrison as Prime Minister. It's an interesting counterbalance to the classic, blame Scotty, he doesn't hold the hose, or equivalent. We're just about finished, but what I'd like to do is to show you some of the material that relates to New South Wales, your grandkids and their employment, with a massive expenditure that's happening in defence. Firstly, have a look at where defence is. The Riverina, Shoalhaven, 2,000 employed. The capital itself, about 800 employed. The Riverina, 2,300 employed. The Hunter, 5,000 employed. Sydney, 15,000 employed. These are direct jobs at this time working in defence-funded activity. Have a look at where 2nd Division now has units or responsibilities, even though it's administering them out of Randwick Barracks. And if you'd like to have a look at some of this, just get up on the website and have a look at the presentations. Have a look at the list of things we do at Mulwala on the New South Wales-Victorian border in terms of manufacturing explosives. Have a look at the list of what Benalla does in terms of manufacturing the ordnance that contains the actual explosives. Have a look at what Orchard Hills will be as a major weaponry site, and particularly for naval warfare. Orchard Hills is designated as the major production and storage and repair facility for naval missiles. And all I've got to say is that there's a serious amount of employment and a serious amount of defence expenditure. And finally, if you wonder where we stand, have a look at this. I'll just read out the point. We rank 11th in the world in military expenditure. We're the 3rd largest arms importer in the world. In other words, we don't make, we buy. And that leads back to the Carl Gustav type situation. But we now are looking at the largest commitment in defence spending since World War II. And if you happen to go, here is the list that New South Wales defence industry is saying, this is where we will get jobs in New South Wales because of that expansion. So what I'd like to finish by saying is, in my opinion, we've had a stimulating year. We've had a wide range of stuff. It's a great tribute to Ron and his committee that we've been able to put this stuff together. And again, thank you so much for that. And finally, as we face next year, can I remind you of the Confucian curse? May you live in interesting times, because we certainly do. It's far better than the Arabian curse, which is, may the fleas of 1,000 camels inhabit your armpit. So I picked the Confucian curse ahead. For everybody, on behalf of the board, thank you for your support, thank you for effort, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to a great next year. And again, thank you for being with us today. Thanks indeed.